You're listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus of the Lotri Foundation. In this podcast, Shaykh Zahir explains the aphorisms from Ibn Ata'illah's famous book of wisdoms, Al-Hikam Al-Ata'iyah, a classical manual of spiritual development. Visit seekershub.org for online courses, our reliable answer service, and engaging media.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما بفضلك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Ameen. So we're doing the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah, this book by Shaykh Ibn Ata'illah, on one's journeying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or on one's relationship, how to better one's relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in it of itself, he talks about the book is comprised of just as a review, the book is comprised of statements that gets you to think about yourself and where you stand in terms of your relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it could be looked at from a point of etiquette, that you have an etiquette of with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in this today's hikmah, Ibn Ata'illah, he's going to talk about expectations, the expectation of the servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because everyone has and everyone expects and thinks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has expectations of their Lord, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those expectations are coupled with dua, they're coupled sometimes with the asking of the servant, the supplication of the servant, and asking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for goodness, or asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for avoidance of detriment from coming to one. That's what the servant asks of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so in this particular hikmah, like the one that we covered yesterday and a couple of weeks ago, what you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what you're going to find with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What you think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what you're going to find. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in a hadith Qudsi, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, "Ana indi dhanni abdi bi," that I am as my servant thinks of me, or that whatever the servant thinks of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what they're going to find with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is what they're going to see in and of themselves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If a servant thinks that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, then he's going to find the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without a doubt that he's going to find with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's going to find that mercy. He's going to find that recourse to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and even the things that may not, as others may things that people may not assume to be merciful, that servant, because he's overwhelmed by the attribute of mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's going to look at things that happen to him through that area of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attribute. That's how he's going to look. The people, the scholars of spirituality, they sometimes divide people into categories. They divide people into categories. And the reason they divide people into categories is in order for them to assess what they need. What do I mean? There are people in certain categories. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who places categories in Quran. It's not us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed certain categories. He places mu'mineen. He talks about mu'mineen. He talks about kafirin, believers, disbelievers. He talks about mushrikeen, idolaters. Amongst the believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala divides them into categories. He talks about the anbiya, the prophets. He talks about the siddiqeen, the ones who are true and truthful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He talks about salihin, the ones who are righteous. He talks about ashabul yameen, the companions on the right. He talks about ashab al-shimal in Surah Al-Waqiyah, about the companions on the left. He talks about ulul al-absar. He talks about the ones who are foremost in knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has differentiated and categorized people in the Quran. And a servant can fall into one or many of these categories. So this person may fall into siddiqeen, he may fall into salihin, he may fall into muhsineen, the one who excel. These categories, a person can fall into many of them. And associated with these categories are characteristics. Associated with these categories are traits. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, when you dissect the Quran, you'll see that certain of these categories have specific traits. They have specific traits. So likewise, in the books of the scholars of spirituality, they have and they talk about different categories. And the different categories allow a doctor to assess and allow a doctor to give what is needed for that servant to A, correct themselves, or correct their thinking, or correct their etiquette with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what the categories are placed. So that one can look at it and see which category one falls into. And then the assessment begins, and then the rectification of the person, their thinking, or their behavior, or their thought, can be corrected. Or even their actions. Perhaps even their actions can be corrected. And so Ibn Ata'illah, he talks about this category here of there's two type of people that he'll talk about in this category. He says, وَإِن لَمْ تَحْسُنْ ظَنُّكَ بِهِ لِأَجْلِ جَمِيلٍ وَصْفِهِ حَسَنَ ظَنُّكَ بِهِ لِوُجُودِ مُعَامَلَتِهِ مَعَكَ فهل أودك إلا الحسنا ولا أسعد إليك إلا المنن. So he says, he says that if you do not think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you do not think the best of Him because of His intrinsic goodness, if you do not think of the best of him because of his intrinsic goodness, then think the best of him because of his dealings with you. If you do not think the best of him because of the intrinsic goodness in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he has, then think the best of him because of his dealings with you. And then he says, for has he ever given to you or brought to you or bestowed upon you anything but good? Has he ever brought to you anything but good? And has he ever given to you, has he ever vouchsafed to you anything but gifts? Has he ever given back to you anything but gifts? These are the two questions that he asked in the end. And so the expecting the best from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be done by two things. It can either be done by the thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the best of thoughts about Allah subhanahu, can be done by looking at his attributes. Looking at his attributes and the goodness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to one. Or thinking the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be thought of by his mu'amalat, his dealings with you, or what he has given to you. The servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is one which is better. The one which is better is the first one. The one that thinking the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of his intrinsic goodness, because of the attribute of his goodness to you, his mercy to you, his forgiveness of you, his rizq to you, and so on, rather than the second. Because the second there's an issue with the second one, that the servant can happen upon himself. And this is the problematic area of it. So in the first group, who think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of his awsaf, because of his attributes. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes never change. Never. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributes are part of his that, part of him. They cannot be removed. The attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are intrinsic to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first group, it is not feared in the first group who have they think the best of Allah because of the attributes, because the attributes never change. The attributes are never decreased, or the attributes can never be taken away. So it's not to be feared from this verse group that they're going to change their position or their thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because they have certainty, they have yaqeen, certainty. So no matter what happens to this servant, their certainty with Allah never decreases. They're certain. No matter what happens. No matter what happens. Trials, tribulations, tests, success, whatever happens, their certainty with Allah never changes. They never veer off course. They never second guess Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They never fall into blame of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their heart is full with tranquility. Their heart is full with tranquility. And their heart is full with tranquility, and they never accuse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They never make an accusation against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they don't think bad of Him. They don't think bad of Him. They never say to themselves, oh, why did Allah send this to me? No, they rather think good of Allah. And they look at the challenges that come to them in a positive light, and they say, oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perhaps want me to do something else, or wants me to challenge myself, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants me to to ask Him more of and for this matter. This is the first group, because their thinking good of Allah is connected to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they always know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful. They have certainty in it. It doesn't waver. They always know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving. They always know, and they have certainty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Razzaq. They always know this. And so they don't waver in it, in their certainty with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second group, however, when they think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of His dealings with them, what happens to people in this category is they can waver. They can waver. Because their sense of strength, of firmness, is reliant upon how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or how they perceive Allah dealing with them. It's their perception. So they will think good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when things are good. They will think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they're looking at external actions. They're looking at external actions. That's what they're looking at. And so the varying actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have the various actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have various effects on them. The effects will be different. The varying actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will leave varying effects on this person. And so when something displeasing happens to them, their heart will weaken, meaning their resolve, their thinking good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will dissipate. It will. Because they think good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of outward actions. And so when outward actions are pleasing, they will think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, when outward actions, external actions are not, then their heart wavers and it weakens. Their heart wavers and there weakens. And so they're not completely free or void of thinking bad of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not completely void of it. They're not completely void of thinking bad of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they tend to listen to their lower self whispering to themselves. They tend to listen to their lower selves whispering, the whispering of the lower selves, which causes what to them? It causes what? It causes them to have two characteristics that are not good for the servant to have. It causes them to be anxious, and it causes them to be impatient. It causes them to be anxious, and it causes them to be impatient. What happens to a servant who's anxious and impatient? What happens? They will constantly fight against the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they just don't understand it. They just don't understand. And so they will see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pushing them back and not pushing them forward. They will see that, and they will blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will say, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do this to me? In a negative light. They won't see it as an opportunity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaching them, learning, trying to learn, trying to bring them closer, trying to make them more strong, trying to push them in a proper direction. They won't see that. They will be pushed into blaming of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will be pushed into blaming of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when that happens to the servant, then it is his hawa, it is his ego and his desire that will take the better of him. It's his desire that will take better of him. A servant who is in this category, Nasrallah Afiyah, a servant who is in that category, what do they need? Thankfulness. Everything needs thankfulness. A servant in that category needs to assess what he has to be or she has to be thankful for. They have to assess it. And they have to consistently thank Allah. Consistently. They have to consistently thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have to look at blessings. Because their concentration of their mind on one or two things that have not happened in the way that they expect it to happen. Their concentration on how Allah deals with them in terms of external actions and in terms of what comes to them and their expectations of what they want. Because of it, they have missed from looking at all the good that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought to them. They've missed it. They have not seen the nur of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they're blinded of seeing the nur, the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their lives. They're blinded by it, completely veiled by it. To remove the veil, they got to be thankful. They got to voice their thanks. To remove this veil, they got to consistently, continually voice their thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala until they're so overwhelmed by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought to them, given to them, bestowed upon them. They're so overwhelmed by it that it leads them back into thinking good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It leads them back into thinking good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because what does Ibn Ata'illah say? He says, has he ever bestowed upon you anything but good? In the end of this hikmah, has he given you anything illa the goodness? And has he bestowed or vouchsafed to you anything but gifts? Has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ever given you anything except that it was good? And has he ever given you anything and vouchsafed to you anything except that it was a gift? And a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means that it's something that doesn't have to come and that you probably didn't ask for. But He gave it anyhow. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continually gives to His servant without even His servant have to ask Him. The servant doesn't have to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for gifts to come to him. We don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for eyesight, good eyesight. He gives it to us. We don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Him to allow us to feel and to touch things, but He gives it to us. We certainly don't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Him to allow us to distinguish letters and words and to understand it, but He does anyhow. We sit here, we're understanding and we're listening, and we can make out words that I'm speaking. We didn't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. We didn't. All these are gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He doesn't have to give it. And He doesn't have to allow us the ability to listen or to hear or to sit or to cross our legs. He doesn't have to give us the ability to do it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the ability without us having to ask for it. And so these are gifts because we don't ask for it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon it. So the servant has to, so what does he mean by here with these two questions in the end? Is that the servant has to turn inward into thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he has to understand, and the servant will understand something, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعَسَى أَن تَقْرُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ, that perhaps you may hate something and it becomes the best thing for you. You may not like something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may send something to you, you may not like it. And in the end it turns out to be the best thing for you. Because one is dealing with the external, separated from the internal, from hikmah, from the wisdom. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَعَسَى أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌّ لَكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and perhaps you may love something. عَسَى أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا, that you may love something and it becomes the worst thing for you. It becomes the most detrimental thing for you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. and Allah knows, and you do not know. You do not know. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who knows, and you do not know. So, judging by external forms, if the forms are good, and the external actions are good, then we think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's dangerous. Rather, we should think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by His attributes, because it's constant. We think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because we know for certain He is Ar-Rahman. We know for certain that He is the most merciful, and we see it in our lives. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ar-Razzaq, is an intrinsic goodness. And so we know that He is the one who gives and the one who provides. And that's constant. And so we think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of that attribute. And so with that, when the servant is on that, when he thinks good of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of His attributes, then the servant never wavers in his certainty with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he never ends up blaming Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is an exercise, and it is an internal exercise that the servant has to do. No one can give anyone certainty. No one. What Ibn Ata'illah is talking about here, no one can give it to you. You have to work on it yourself. That's why this book is a book of work. It's a book of how to correct your etiquette, your adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you have to do it. You can be guided of how to do it, but you have to do the work yourself. You have to do the work yourself in order to rectify how you conceive and what you think of your Lord. And when you conceive of it and when you think the best of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of His attributes, then the servant becomes in the state of being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The servant become pleased with their Lord in all things, in all actions, in all realm. The servant is extremely pleased with his Lord. And then the servant is the servant who is happy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala no matter what He gives to them or what He brings to them or what He withholds from them. The servant is still pleased. He still has a rida of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this servant is not the servant who has anxiety or is anxious or is depressed. The servant never goes into those states. And he's a servant who is patient. And that servant is the servant who becomes successful, not only in this world but in the next world, because he looks at everything external as being success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it is. Everything Allah gives is success in the end to the servant, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have given you worse. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us, guide us, forgive us, have mercy upon us, forgive our elders, our parents. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them, give them good health and long life. Those who are sick, may Allah subhanahu heal them and cure them. Those who have passed away, may Allah subhanahu grant them His mercy, His maghfirah and His shade. May Allah subhanahu protect our children, keep them on the straight path, make their footing firm in His deen. May Allah subhanahu increase us in knowledge and practice of our deen, make our footing firm in His sirat. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who are faced with challenges and difficulties, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remove it from them. May Allah subhanahu give them patience to deal with it and deal with those challenges. May Allah subhanahu grant them success with those challenges. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help them and guide them, help us and guide us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our homes from amongst the homes of the believers and make our last words our best words. Subhanaka wa hamdik shadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you for listening to The Hikam with Shaykh Zahir Bacchus. Help Seekers Hub spread the light of guidance to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.